Maplestory the Novel, Season 1, Sacred Tears. Written by Tatsumari Korisuno. Episode 1, Part 1, Tinge. She had tried everything that she could think of, battling against the thousands of his soldiers, and still he came as though he were brushing aside a lock of his hair. The last-ditch effort was to run to the innermost chambers where Rin was for safekeeping and escape from their home, the Temple of Time. Running past the final line of defense, she called the Oblivion Knights to attention, telling Lekira that they must hold the line. The Red Bull nodded, turning his attention to the sound of marching down the hall. Fire blazed around his hooves and horns, billowing from his snout. Ariel could hear the sound of her final and most potent general let out a desperate billow, the thunder of his hooves fading down the hall and crashing into the oncoming soldiers. She hoped to hold slow long enough to gather Rin and escape. When Ariel burst through the doors, she realized she was too late. Slow was already standing next to her bed, gently brushing his finger across her cheek as she slept. "I'm surprised she's managed to sleep through the sound of battle," Slow smirked.
"Get away from her!"
Ariel screamed, holding her hand out as a flame roared to life. Slow appeared before her, grabbing her wrist with slow speed and locking eyes with her, malicious whispers hanging in the air around them. Shrieking cries of a woman in labor split the evening air in Magatia. Minutes dragged as hours. The light of Carl's home dimmed and flashed with the child's arrival into the world, making him momentarily ponder it. As the child began to emerge, the mother's cries came all the higher as the child pulled his way out of his mother. With another great heave from Adelia, the child was free at last, letting out a great cry, screaming his distaste of the world's cold air. His screams were soon rested, wrapped in a warm blanket, and brought to his exhausted mother and proud father. "Have you a name for the child?" Carl asked, with eager curiosity. Adelia, not yet having caught her breath, looked to her husband for a moment, leaning down to Adelia's face to hear her exhausted whispers. Maxis, the father, repeated the name she had picked out even before she had married. "Dane. His name shall be Dane," answered Maxis, cradling Dane in one arm while holding the hand of Adelia as she fell asleep. Carl nodded and moved aside, allowing nurses to come in and tend to the mother and child, ensuring no complications would come to either of them. After a few days, the new small family began a journey to the holy city of Orion, a custom in Usoria. There, the child would be blessed by a priest in the order of Minerna, an honor that most considered to come at a high price. Those that didn't have the money would call for a traveling bishop to bless their child in the name of one of 3 deities who ruled time, light, or life. Unfortunately, many children lived out their lives without a blessing, as bishops were so few. Those that did exist were tasked with hundreds of thousands of families seeking such a blessing or spiritual aid. Adelia and Maxis were fortunate enough to be among the few that could afford a blessing of Minerna.
"I wonder what kind of man he will grow up to be,"
Adelia said as they boarded the land ship, which would take them from Magatia to Ariant, a more substantial city in the middle of a sandy sea. "Only time will tell, my love. Fate is a funny thing here in Usoria. Many have the power to change it, while others are guided by it to a destiny we will never understand," he smiled, presenting his ticket to the usher and filing his way to their seats when the driver's voice filled the cabin. "Thank you all for coming. This journey should take approximately 9 hours, assuming that we don't have any problems. I know there are children aboard, so we will have some entertainment for them. Also, we have food and drink. Please remember to stay in your seats, and thank you again for choosing us to be your charter," the pilot announced, returning to the cabin to begin their journey. As Adelia was getting settled, she couldn't help but look up and see an odd man staring at her and Dane. He was pale, with a dark cloak covering his head and body. Turning away from the man, she could feel a slight pressure on the front of her head, but dismissed it as a headache from lack of water. But the man still stared, his glare drawing Adelia's sight back to him. His eyes seemed to burrow into her very soul, forcing her to remember long-forgotten pain and sadness. The longer she watched, the more intense his red-eyed gaze seemed to become. Still, the memories plagued her, her first pet dying and wondering why it had to be her pet, her first breakup, the death of her grandfather and grandmother, being rejected by prestigious schools. All of it came trickling back to her. Shaking her head, she focused her tear-stained attention to the sleeping babe in her arms. Instead, the face of a pale man wrapped in a black cloak stared back at her. Panicked, she looked back to the man who held his uncomfortable gaze as she felt a presence come near to her ear. It was torrid and full of hate, stifling even. The presence drew even closer to her ear and whispered with hot breath. "This is but the beginning." A noise jolted Adelia awake, the sight of her face hot from leaning against the window.
My dear, is everything all right? You're pale,
Maxis asked, placing the back of his hand on her forehead. Adelia looked over to him, noting that he was holding Dane in his arms, fast asleep.
How long have I been asleep?
She asked, brushing the long hair out of her face while passing a glance to the seat across the aisle, where a young boy sat.
For most of the trip, we're only a few miles outside of Ariant. Are you sure you're all right?
Maxis asked, looking in the direction she had been staring.
I haven't...
But the words she wanted to say just weren't coming to her, and the man that she thought she saw was nowhere to be seen.
You were tossing and turning in your sleep. Did you have a nightmare?
Maxis asked, resituating Dane in one arm and putting the other around Adelia.
I wouldn't really call it a nightmare, so much as it was a very intense dream or vision,
she whispered. Maxis smiled and rubbed her arm from around her back.
Don't worry. Nothing can hurt you here so long as I am here,
he said, kissing the side of her head. All the same, Adelia couldn't help but wonder if what she had seen was a dream or a vision. She felt a genuine presence standing next to her in the dream that was familiar somehow. Perhaps her family lineage coming from prominent shaman of Aswan was playing a small part. Within minutes, her mind calmed, forgetting about the dream as they pulled into the bustling city of Ariant. Adelia couldn't help but notice the periodic beggars and homeless that skirted the marketplace and station as they made their way to the main ticket booth. Maxis's work as a scientist in Magatia often left them with a surplus of money. Most, if not all, would be donated to traveling bishops visiting Magatia to help the people such as these. As he rifled through his pockets for his coin purse, Maxis caught her stare and sighed.
We've done what we can, my love. The bishops know how to best handle the distributions,
he said, trying to quicken his actions to find the coin purse, holding their tickets for the next galleon.
But is it doing any good? Are we the only ones helping?
She asked, noting that the air of this station felt unusually heavy. A strange thing to notice, to be sure, but all the same was odd.
We can't make people help. We can only help with what we can and hope they will follow suit. Where is that blasted purse?
He said with emphasis. Adelia chuckled and reached into his pocket, pulling it out and finding the tickets.
I have it,
she said as they quickly made their way to the galleon. Once there, they settled into their first-class seats, making sure that Dane was fed and settled as the ship gently pulled out of the dock for Orion. Adelia had no more visions, and her feelings from the previous ride already died away, leaving her hopeful and at peace. As the galleon glided into the dock, 2 attendants came aboard and sought out the couple, presenting a decorative pendant sporting a large blue gem. "We was sent by Bresden of Minerna's order to escort you to the Great Hall," they explained. Maxis and Adelia both nodded in agreement, following them over the cobblestone roads to a building decorated with grand wings on the roof. Inside, intricate gold designs woven into walls and fabrics depicted events and people from all times. At the rear of the building loomed a giant marble statue of a woman, its arms outstretched to the floor, and her wise eyes smiled down on any below. Once near the main sanctuary, the attendants directed them where to meet the Fatri and bid them farewell. As they neared, they could overhear the sounds of grumbling coming from one of the side rooms.
I am a Fatri of Minerna, not some lowly bishop to be summoned for a child's blessing. You would think the order would acknowledge that.
Maxis and Adelia looked to one another as they waited. The Fatri pushed aside the curtain and exited the room, still adjusting the sash around his shoulder. When he caught sight of them, he squared his shoulders and folded his hands.
Welcome to the Temple of Minerna. I trust the child is healthy?
The priest sighed while stepping closer to them.
Yes, Vatri. A healthy boy by the name of Dane.
Adelia answered. Holding out his hand and turning his head away, the Fatri waited for one of them to take it and kiss his ring. The two of them looked to one another in confusion, unsure of what needed to be done. When a long while went by without any action being taken, he opened one of his eyes and looked down, wiggling his hand twice and waiting for them to kiss his ring.
I'm sorry to ask, but has something changed within the customs of Minerna's order that I am unaware of?
Maxis asked. The Fatri's shoulders slumped and turned his eyes up into his brow, dropping his hand to his side.
I am a Tatsumari of Minerna, and should be shown the respect as such, as I am the voice of the Great Mother herself,
he answered with a huff, holding his hand out once more, this time making it much clearer his ring should be kissed. Maxis bowed low and apologized, taking his hand and bowing enough that his forehead touched the ring. The Fatri rolled his eyes and pulled his hand away, holding his hands out to receive the child.
Dust-bitten rats should be taught better,
he thought, looking over Dane's facial features and serious blue-gray eyes as he was placed in his arms. As the Fatri looked him over, the air around the three of them almost seemed to dim as something felt like it washed over him. A presence of duality and despair filled with deep-rooted pain as thoughts of his late son came to mind.
What is it you would like the child blessed with?
He stammered, while memories of his son rushed to him. He had performed this very same blessing on his own newborn son nearly 10 years ago.
We only wish that he would grow to be a happy and prosperous man someday,
Maxis said, putting his arm around Adelia and pulling her close. The priest nodded, turning to the main altar, trying to compose himself for the actual blessing. His vision blurred as he recited the words under the intense gaze of the child, making his own heart ache. He and his wife had been trying for years, and when his son was finally born, they were overjoyed. But a week after the blessing, the small child became ill and passed away. The child in his hands seemed to be reaching into his soul and grasping on to that sadness. When at last the blessing was complete, the priest's voice hitched and wavered as he spoke to the parents.
May Minerna smile upon you and the days of your child. There is something strong at work with this family. Go in peace.
The priest smiled, folding his hands and watching them as they left, cuddling their child and speaking to him. When at last they were out of sight, the priest collapsed to his knees and broke down bawling. After he had buried his child, the grief was too much for his wife to take, and she threw herself from the topmost tower of Minerna's temple. The priest said she had been begging Minerna for answers, but when it seemed no answer came, she jumped, the memory fading as he furiously worked in the service of the order, until now.
What fate would befall this child that he would have such power?
He asked to the winds, asking another priest to take over for him while he dealt with his pain.